Letter 1 of Letters to Catherine E. Beecher in reply to an essay on slavery and abolitionism. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amelia Chesley. Letters to Catherine E. Beecher in reply to an essay on slavery and abolitionism addressed to A. E. Grimké. Revised by the author, Angelina Emily Grimké. Letter 1. Fundamental Principle of Abolitionists. 6th month, 12th, 1837. My dear friend, thy book has appeared just at a time when, from the nature of my engagements, it will be impossible for me to give it that attention which so weighty a subject demands. Incessantly occupied in prosecuting a mission, the responsibilities of which task all my powers, I can reply to it only by desultory letters, thrown from my pen as I travel from place to place. I prefer this mode to that of taking as long a time to answer it as thou didst to determine upon the best method by which to counteract the effect of my testimony at the North, which, as the preface of thy book informs me, was thy main design. Thou thinkest I have not been sufficiently informed in regard to the feelings and opinions of Christian females at the North on the subject of slavery, for that, in fact, they hold the same principles with abolitionists, although they condemn their measures. Wilt thou permit me to receive their principles from thy pen? Thus instructed, however misinformed I may heretofore have been, I can hardly fail of attaining to accurate knowledge. Let us examine them to see how far they correspond with the principles held by abolitionists. The great fundamental principle of abolitionists is that man cannot rightfully hold his fellow man as property. Therefore we affirm that every slaveholder is a man-stealer. We do so for the following reasons. To steal a man is to rob him of himself. It matters not whether this be done in Guinea or Carolina. A man is a man, and as a man he has inalienable rights, among which is the right to personal liberty. Now, if every man has an inalienable right to personal liberty, it follows that he cannot rightfully be reduced to slavery. But I find in these United States 2,250,000 men, women, and children robbed of that to which they have an inalienable right. How comes this to pass? Where millions are plundered, are there no plunderers? If, then, the slaves have been robbed of their liberty, who has robbed them? Not the man who stole their forefathers from Africa, but he who now holds them in bondage, no matter how they came into his possession, whether he inherited them, or bought them, or seized them at their birth on his own plantation. The only difference I can see between the original man-stealer who caught the African in his native country and the American slaveholder is that the former committed one act of robbery, while the other perpetrates the same crime continually. Slaveholding is the perpetrating of acts, all of the same kind, in a series, the first of which is technically called man-stealing. The first act robbed the man of himself, and the same state of mind that prompted that act keeps up the series. Having taken his all from him, it keeps his all from him, not only refusing to restore, but still robbing him of all he gets, and as fast as he gets it. Slaveholding, then, is the constant or habitual perpetration of the act of man-stealing. To make a slave is man-stealing, the act itself. To hold him such is man-stealing, the habit, the permanent state, made up of individual acts. In other words, to begin to hold a slave is man-stealing. To keep on holding him is merely a repetition of the first act, a doing the same identical thing all the time. A series of the same acts continued for a length of time is a habit, a permanent state, and the first of this series of the same acts that make up this habit or state is just like all the rest. If every slave has a right to freedom, then surely the man who withholds that right from him today is a man-stealer, though he may not be the first person who has robbed him of it. Hence we find that Wesley says, "Men buyers are exactly on a level with men stealers." And again, "Much less is it possible that any child of man should ever be born a slave." Here also Jonathan Edwards, "To hold a man in a state of slavery is to be every day guilty of robbing him of his liberty, or of man stealing." And Grotius says, "Those are men stealers who abduct, keep, sell, or buy slaves or free men." If thou meanest merely that acts of that same nature, but differently located in the series, are designated by different terms, thus pointing out their different relative positions, then thy argument concedes what we affirm, the identity in the nature of the acts, and thus it dwindles to a mere philological criticism, or rather a mere play on words. These are abolition sentiments on the subject of slaveholding, and although our principles are universally held by our opposers at the North, yet I am told on the 44th page of thy book that "the word man-stealer has one peculiar signification and is no more synonymous with slaveholder than it is with sheep-stealer." I must acknowledge thou hast only confirmed my opinion of the difference which I had believed to exist between abolitionists and their opponents. As well might Saul have declared that he held similar views with Stephen, when he stood by and kept the raiment of those who slew him. I know that a broad line of distinction is drawn between our principles and our measures by those who are anxious to avoid the appearance of evil, very desirous of retaining the fair character of enemies to slavery. Now, our measures are simply the carrying out of our principles, and we find that just in proportion as individuals embrace our principles in spirit and in truth, they cease to cavil at our measures. Gerrit Smith is a striking illustration of this. Who cavilled more at anti-slavery measures, and who more ready now to acknowledge his former blindness? Real abolitionists know full well that the slave never has been and never can be a whit the better for mere abstractions floating in the head of any man. And they also know that principles fixed in the heart are things of another sort. The former have never done any good in the world, because they possess no vitality, and therefore cannot bring forth the fruits of wholly untiring effort. But the latter live in the lives of their possessors, and breathe in their words. And I am free to express my belief that all who really and heartily approve of our principles will also approve our measures, and that too just as certainly as a good tree will bring forth good fruit. But there is another peculiarity in the views of abolitionists. We hold that the North is guilty of the crime of slaveholding. We assert that it is a national sin. On the contrary, in thy book I find the following acknowledgment. "Most persons in the non-slaveholding states have considered the matter of Southern slavery as one in which they were no more called to interfere than in the abolition of the press-gang system in England or the tithe system in Ireland." Now I cannot see how the same principles can produce such entirely different opinions. Can a good tree bring forth corrupt fruit? This I deny, and cannot admit what thou art anxious to prove, namely that "public opinion may have been wrong on this point, and yet right on all those great principles of rectitude and justice relating to slavery." If abolition principles are generally adopted at the North, how comes it to pass that there is no abolition action here, except what is put forth by a few despised fanatics, as they are called? Is there any living faith without works? Can the sap circulate vigorously, and yet neither blossoms put forth nor fruit appear? Again, I am told on the 7th page that all Northern Christians believe it is a sin to hold a man in slavery for mere purposes of gain, as if this was the whole abolition principle on this subject. I can assure thee that abolitionists do not stop here. Our principle is that no circumstances can ever justify a man in holding his fellow man as property. It matters not what motive he may give for such a monstrous violation of the laws of God. The claim to him as property is an annihilation of his right to himself, which is the foundation upon which all his other rights are built. It is high-handed robbery of Jehovah, for he has declared, "All souls are mine." For myself, I believe there are hundreds of thousands at the South who do not hold their slaves by any means as much for purposes of gain as they do from the lust of power. This is the passion that reigns triumphant there, and those who do not know this have much yet to learn. Where, then, is the similarity in our views? I forbear for the present, and subscribe myself thine, but not in the bonds of gospel abolitionism. A. E. Grimké. End of Letter 1.